I don't know what possessed me to go along with it that night. Maybe it was boredom or a need to prove something, but when Mark suggested we check out the old Wilson farmhouse, I didn't hesitate. I regretted it the moment we slipped through the gap in the overgrown hedgerow. The place had a bad reputation, a tragic story everyone in the village knew. A family of four, all dead within weeks of moving in. Carbon monoxide, they said, but whispers of curses and bad luck clung to the house like the ivy choking its walls. Still, I followed Mark over the broken fence, torchlight flickering against the gaping windows like eyes watching us. The farmhouse loomed in the moonlight, its roof sagging and tiles missing. The door hung off one hinge, swinging gently in the night breeze, creaking like a warning. We stepped inside, boots crunching on broken glass and dead leaves that had blown in over the years. The smell hit me immediately, a sour, damp stench that turned my stomach. The hall was narrow, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips. My torch beam caught a staircase to the left, the wood warped and splintered, leading into a yawning darkness. We stuck to the ground floor, creeping through rooms that were eerily intact. A table still stood in the kitchen, though it was layered with dust and rot. Plates, cracked and faded, sat in the sink. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, abandoned mid-meal, though decades of neglect had twisted it into something nightmarish. I noticed it first in the sitting room, a faint metallic tang in the air. I shone my torch around, stopping on the fireplace. Chains hung from the mantel, heavy and rusted, but they weren't part of the original decor. A closer look showed hooks, too, embedded deep into the brickwork. The hearth was blackened, not with soot, but something darker. My pulse quickened. Mark was a few steps ahead, his torch flitting over the far wall. There, gouged deep into the plaster, were scratches. Not random marks, but crisscrossed lines like a tally. I counted 25, 30. My stomach dropped. We moved further in, past a sideboard stacked with jars. At first I thought they were filled with murky water, but as I angled the light I realized it was something viscous, something that shimmered unnaturally. I couldn't bring myself to look too closely. The back door was boarded up from the inside and the floor here was damp, each step releasing a faint squelch. That's when I saw it, just visible in the corner of the kitchen. A trap. Not the usual animal kind either, a crude contraption of barbed wire and nails all fixed to a spring-loaded plank rigged to a tripwire. My breath caught as I stepped back, careful not to trigger anything. Mark whispered for me to look up and I froze. Dangling from the beams above was a noose, frayed but still strong-looking. It swayed gently, though there was no draft. Something clattered upstairs, a sharp noise that made us both jerk towards the staircase. My torch wobbled, the beam darting across the ceiling. I thought I saw movement just for a second in the corner of my eye, a shadow shifting. We didn't speak, we didn't breathe. Then another sound, a dragging scrape like something heavy being pulled across the floorboards. Mark turned to me, his face pale and set, and gestured to leave. I nodded, but as we crept back towards the front door, something caught my boot. A taut wire snapped, and suddenly a loud metallic clang erupted behind me. I spun, the torch flickering wildly, and saw a second trap. A spiked weight had fallen from the ceiling, slamming into the floor just inches from where I had been. We bolted, the house felt alive as we ran, creaks and groans following us, the shadows bending and twisting. My torch cut out just as we reached the door, plunging us into pitch black. I stumbled, hands grasping blindly, and felt the edge of the door frame. My heart thundered as I pushed through, nearly collapsing onto the overgrown grass outside. Mark was ahead, already scrambling over the fence. I didn't stop running until we reached the road, panting and gasping under the cold, clear night sky. I didn't dare look back at the house, but even as we left it behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, a presence lingering just out of sight. I'd seen the scratches on the walls, the traps rigged with cruel precision. Someone was living in that house, or something, and it had let us leave, for now. I've spent most of my life hunting, tracking animals, and getting used to the quiet of the woods. So when my friends suggested we try out the caves near the old quarry, I figured it would be an easy trip. We'd spent weeks hiking through the hills, and the idea of a new place to explore sounded exciting. It was supposed to be a quick in and out, just some cave photography, a bit of fun, nothing too serious. We found the entrance just after midday, hidden in a cluster of rocks that had crumbled over time. It wasn't much, a small hole in the ground, barely big enough for one person to crawl through. But when we squeezed through, we found ourselves in a large, cavernous space, the air thick and damp. The place was bigger than I thought. I didn't have much experience with caves, but I had a decent sense of direction, and the echoes in the walls made it feel as though we'd stepped into some forgotten underground world. At first, it was all just tunnels and stone formations, normal enough, but the deeper we went, the more unsettling things became. The first sign was the smell. It wasn't the usual earthy dampness you'd expect, but something foul, rotting, like old meat or something worse. I assumed it was some kind of animal that had died in the caves, maybe a fox or a badger, and we continued. The deeper we went, the more pronounced it became. At first I thought it was just me being paranoid, but the others started to notice it too. Then we found the first sign of what was really going on. A patch of the floor near a narrow passage was stained dark, slick, and clung to my boots like tar. I thought it was just more decay, but as I shone my torch down, I realized something didn't add up. There were pieces of clothing caught in the muck, tattered bits of fabric, some still stained red. My stomach turned, but I kept moving. The others didn't say anything. It wasn't until we reached a wider part of the cave that we saw it properly. There, scattered across the floor, were bags. Dozens of them, ripped open, some half buried in dirt. They were full of things, the kind of things no one should ever have to see. I had to force myself not to look too closely, but it was impossible not to notice the human-like shapes, the twisted remains, the parts that shouldn't have been in a place like this. I felt my heart start to pound, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. There was no way an animal could have done this. This wasn't natural. The others were just as silent as I was. We didn't talk about what we were seeing, but we all knew. The smell was stronger now, overwhelming, the kind that made your throat close up. Something in me told me to turn around and get out, but I didn't want to be the first to say it. I should have. We kept moving, our torches flickering as we stumbled deeper into the cave. The walls seemed to close in on us, and I could feel the tension in the air, like we were being watched, though I couldn't explain why. My mind kept racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no explanation for what we were finding. At one point, we stumbled upon what looked like a small makeshift camp, a sleeping bag, a fire pit long gone cold, and tools. Dirty knives, a hammer with dried blood on the handle. I felt a chill go through me. We were so far in by then, I wasn't sure we'd be able to find our way back. My sense of direction was shot, and that's when we heard it, a shuffle in the distance, faint at first, like someone dragging something heavy along the stone. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. My eyes flicked to the others, but no one said anything. No one moved. Another shuffle, closer this time, and then a slow scraping, like metal against rock. I'm not sure how long we stood there, frozen in the dark, but the noise didn't stop. The closer it got, the more it sounded like footsteps. Not normal footsteps, though, the kind of footsteps you hear when someone's dragging their feet behind them, like they're not quite walking properly. I wanted to turn and run, but we were too deep. I had no idea where the entrance was anymore. The noise stopped suddenly, and in the silence I thought I could hear breathing, slow, laboured, coming from just beyond the bend in the tunnel. I didn't move. Neither did anyone else. My heart was in my throat. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to. A shadow passed by, just visible in the dim light. For a second I thought I saw something hunched over, its body twisted unnaturally, dragging something behind it. Then it was gone. We didn't need to say anything. We all turned and started running. The sound of footsteps followed us, but we never looked back. My legs were heavy with fear, and every step felt like it took me deeper into the darkness. The walls of the cave seemed to close in tighter with every turn, and I was sure we weren't going to make it out. The breath in my lungs felt shallow, but somehow we found our way back to the opening. When I saw the daylight again, I thought I could finally breathe, but I didn't. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something following us, some twisted thing dragging itself behind us into the sun. I don't know who or what was down there, but I don't ever want to find out again. We made it out, but I know what we saw. And I know we weren't alone in those caves. And I don't think whoever or whatever was down there is done yet. We found the campground just as the sun was dipping low, its light bleeding gold and orange through the trees. It was perfect, really. A small clearing surrounded by pines with a view of a still lake reflecting the sky like glass. There was no one else around, not a single car or camper in sight. It should have felt peaceful, but the quiet was unsettling, like we'd stumbled onto a place where people weren't supposed to be. We parked the van on the edge of the clearing, overlooking the water. It had been a long drive, and I was looking forward to a night of stillness. No rumbling engine, just the sound of the breeze through the trees. After dinner, we sat outside in foldable chairs, sipping cheap wine and watching the stars come out one by one. By the time we turned in, the darkness was absolute. Without the glow of streetlights or the hum of distant cars, it felt like the world had shrunk to just us and the van. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and settled into the small bed, the cool night air creeping through the cracks in the door seals. I woke up suddenly, the kind of wakefulness that hits you like a slap. I heard its footsteps, crunching through the gravel just outside. I lay still, barely breathing, straining to listen. Whoever it was moved around the van, the sound growing louder and then fading as they circled. My chest tightened, my mind racing through all the rational explanations. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe we'd parked too close to someone's property and they were coming to tell us to leave. But there was no light, no voice, no reason for someone to be walking so quietly. The footsteps stopped by the driver's side door. I heard a faint rattle, the sound of the handle being tried. My stomach turned to ice. The locks held, but the handle jiggled again, harder this time, like whoever it was wanted to test if they could force it open. Then came the knocking, not a polite knock, but a heavy, rhythmic thud. It echoed through the van, each strike rattling the thin metal walls. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay still, stay quiet. The knocking moved, first to the passenger side, then to the back doors, as if they were trying to find the weakest point. I thought about the phone in my bag, but we'd been in a dead zone all day. No signal, no one to call. The only thing between us and them was a flimsy lock on a cheap van door. There was a pause, long enough that I almost convinced myself they'd gone. But then came the scraping. A sharp sound like metal dragging against metal. It started low, near the wheels, and then worked its way up. A jagged screech that made my teeth ache. The van rocked slightly as they moved, and I realized with a sick jolt what they were doing. The tires. I couldn't stop myself. I peeked out through the edge of the curtain, just enough to catch a glimpse. A figure stood there, illuminated by the faint moonlight. They weren't in a hurry, crouched by the wheel with something in their hand, working methodically. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of them, tall and thin, their movements calm. I ducked back before they could see me, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. The van creaked as they moved again, their footsteps circling back to the side door. There was a metallic clang as something struck the handle, then silence. I stayed awake all night, every muscle tense, waiting for the next sound, the next knock, the next scrape. But nothing came. When the sun finally started to rise, turning the trees outside into silhouettes, I dared to look again. The figure was gone, the tires were slashed, deep gashes in the rubber and long scratches marred the sides of the van. The paint peeled back in jagged lines. The handles were dented and the ground around the van was littered with small, sharp pieces of metal, shards of something I couldn't identify. The clearing was empty, the lake still, the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. It was as if the night had swallowed them whole, leaving no trace except for the damage and the hollow feeling in my chest. The couple's car rolled into town just after sundown, the faint hum of its engine breaking the stillness that had settled over the countryside. I watched them from my perch in the shadows, my rifle slung over my back. They were out-of-towners, no doubt about it. Their shiny car and city clothes made them stick out like a sore thumb in our quiet, forgotten corner of the world. They'd taken the wrong turn, the one everyone in the area knew to avoid. This place wasn't meant for strangers. We had a way of life here, a way that didn't welcome prying eyes or curious visitors. The others would have seen them by now. I'd make sure of it. They pulled up outside the old service station, its sign faded and hanging by a single chain. The man got out first, stretching and looking around like he expected someone to come out and greet him. The woman stayed in the car, her eyes scanning the darkness that was creeping in around them. They didn't know it yet, but they'd made a mistake coming here. I stayed quiet, moving around the edge of the buildings where the shadows were deepest. My boots barely made a sound on the packed dirt as I kept to the outskirts. The others wouldn't take long. These things never did. The man went inside the station, the door creaking on its hinges. The woman stepped out of the car, wrapping her arms around herself and glancing over her shoulder. Her unease was palpable, and it brought a grim smile to my face. She could feel it, the eyes on her, the wrongness of this place. The truck pulled up moments later, headlights cutting through the gloom. 3 of them got out, the usual crew. I stayed back, letting them do their thing. They'd block the road first, always the road. The way out would be gone before the couple even knew what was happening. When the man came out of the station, he stopped, dead in his tracks. He saw the truck, the men, the way they stood there watching him. He said something to the woman. She looked over, her face pale even in the fading light. They climbed back into their car, the engine revving as they turned towards the main road. I'd already moved ahead, cutting through the woods to the place where the road narrowed. It was easy to get there before them, easy to set up the chain and padlock across the way. The headlights caught me just as I disappeared into the trees. They slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the gravel. I could hear them now, panicked voices spilling into the night. The man got out again, walking to the chain and trying to yank it free. It didn't budge. He looked back at the car, waving at the woman, but she didn't move. Her eyes were wide, locked on the darkness around them. The others weren't far behind. I saw their truck's lights bouncing through the trees, heard the crunch of their boots on the gravel. They'd flank the car, corner them like we always did. The man wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. I moved closer, circling back towards the car. The woman was out now, standing by the passenger door. She clutched something in her hand, maybe her phone, though it wouldn't do her any good. There was no signal out here, there never was. The man was shouting now, his voice sharp and angry, but the others didn't respond. They never did. They just kept walking, closing the distance, their bodies blending into the shadows until they were almost invisible. The woman turned, her breath hitching as she finally spotted them. She grabbed the man's arm, pulling him towards the car, but it was already too late. The truck's engine roared to life again, its headlights glaring as it blocked the car's retreat. The couple froze, caught between the truck and the figures emerging from the trees. The man held up his hands, shouting something I couldn't make out, but it didn't matter. The woman stumbled back, her foot catching on the edge of the road, and she fell. I stayed where I was, watching from the cover of the trees as the others moved in. The couple's screams were muffled by the roar of the truck, the sound of boots on gravel, the sharp crack of something heavy hitting metal. The light from the truck cast long shadows, flickering like a dying flame. When it was over, the truck's headlights turned off. The darkness rushed back in, thick and suffocating. I waited a few moments longer, listening to the silence that followed. Then I turned and walked back into the woods, the rifle steady on my back. They wouldn't be found. They never were. It started as an ordinary night. I showed up at this self-storage facility a little after 10, keys in one hand, a flask of coffee in the other. The job was simple: sit in the little office, keep an eye on the cameras, and make sure nobody was sneaking in after hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The place was quiet, tucked away on the edge of town, with long rows of steel storage units lit by dim floodlights. I made my usual rounds first thing. The facility had a low chain-link fence surrounding it, and everything looked fine. Locks on the units secure, gates closed, no signs of tampering. The night air was cold, and I could hear the hum of the lights overhead. It was just another shift. I went back to the office, settled into the swivel chair, and started scrolling through my phone. The hours dragged like they always did. Midnight came and went, and the only sounds were the occasional click from the ancient clock on the wall and the hum of the monitors. Then, around 1 in the morning, I noticed something strange. One of the cameras near the gate was blurry, like the lens had been smudged. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes bugs or condensation caused issues, but when I switched to the next camera in the line, the footage froze for a second before jumping back to life. A shiver ran through me, though I didn't know why. It was probably just a technical glitch. I decided to check it out. Grabbing the torch from the desk, I stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, and my breath came out in small clouds. The place was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked towards the gate. When I reached it, my stomach dropped. The chain that usually hung loosely around the gate was now wrapped tight, secured with a heavy padlock I didn't recognize. My hand started to tremble as I tugged at it. It wasn't one of ours. Someone had locked me in. I turned back towards the office, my mind racing. Maybe this was some kind of prank? The facility wasn't exactly Fort Knox, and I'd seen teenagers hop the fence before. But the padlock felt different. I quickened my pace, my torchlight bouncing over the gravel and steel doors. The office door was closed when I got back. I was sure I'd left it open. My heart thudded in my chest as I reached for the handle. It didn't budge. Locked, I scrambled for the keys in my pocket, fumbling with them as I glanced over my shoulder. The darkness between the rows of storage units seemed thicker than before. When I finally got the door open, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it again. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the phone off the desk. No signal. That was normal for the area, but it had never felt as suffocating as it did now. The landline sat in the corner, but when I picked it up, the line was dead. I checked the cameras again, my eyes darting from screen to screen. The blurry one, near the gate, was now completely dark. Another camera, further down, flickered. For a brief second, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. Something quick, like a figure darting between the units. My throat went dry. I turned off the lights in the office, hoping whoever was out there wouldn't notice me. The monitors cast an eerie glow, and I crouched beneath the desk, trying to stay out of sight. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Every creak of the building made me flinch. Then, on one of the monitors, I saw it. A figure. It was tall, dressed in dark clothes, moving with an unsettling calm. They walked slowly between the rows of units, stopping occasionally to look at something out of frame. My chest tightened as they turned towards the camera. The face was obscured, but I could see the shine of a knife in their hand. I fought the urge to scream. They were walking closer, heading towards the office. I turned off the monitors, plunging the room into near darkness. The only sound was my own breathing, shallow and rapid. I reached for the torch, realizing too late that the batteries were dead. The door handle rattled, my body froze, every muscle locked in terror. The rattling stopped, but then I heard footsteps circling the building. A soft tapping sound followed, like something metallic brushing against the walls. I stayed under the desk, praying they'd leave. But the tapping continued, steady, growing louder as it moved closer to the windows. I couldn't bring myself to look. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, crouched and shaking in the dark. When I finally dared to peek over the desk, the window was empty. The monitors, still off, reflected my pale, wide-eyed face. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the storage units outside. It wasn't random. It was slow, like someone opening a unit, one by one. I'd been watching them since they arrived. 4 of them, laughing and talking too loudly, their voices cutting through the stillness of the forest like knives. They carried oversized rucksacks stuffed with camping gear and looked out of place, their bright clothes glaring against the muted greens and browns of the woods. They didn't belong here. It wasn't hard to track them. They left a trail a child could follow, crisp packets half buried in the dirt, boot prints pressed into the soft earth, a scarf snagged on a low-hanging branch. They didn't even try to hide their fire the first night. The orange glow of it flickered through the trees, accompanied by the smell of charred sausages and cheap beer. They were oblivious, heads tilted back to laugh at some joke I couldn't hear. I stayed back, just far enough that they wouldn't see me. I'd positioned myself downwind. It was second nature now. My rifle was slung across my back, not because I planned to use it, but because it felt right there. The weight of it was comforting. The first one, the one who disappeared, was the smallest of the group, a woman with short hair and a red jacket. She'd wandered away from the others after breakfast, her steps crunching through the undergrowth as she took her mug of tea towards the creek. She knelt to rinse it out, her back turned to the trees. She didn't hear me. People like her never did. I'd taken my time with her, leading her deeper into the woods. She didn't scream at first, just stumbled after me, her face pale and her breaths short and quick. The sound of it excited me, but I kept quiet, my movements smooth. She had to know I was in control. When the others noticed she was gone, the forest came alive with the sound of their shouts. They called her name over and over, their voices breaking with panic. I listened from a perch above them, watching their faces twist with fear. The tallest one, a man with a scruffy beard, tried to lead them back the way they came, but they were already too far in, too deep. By nightfall they were huddled together in a small clearing, their fire smaller this time, their faces pale and drawn. They whispered to each other, their heads darting up at every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. I kept close, just out of sight. They couldn't see me, but they knew I was there. The next day they tried to leave. They packed up their things in silence, their eyes darting nervously into the trees. The woman with the plaited hair kept glancing at the spot where her friend had last been seen, her lips trembling. It slowed them down, but not by much. They followed the path, back towards where they thought their car would be. I moved ahead of them, quiet as breath, and waited by the trail. I'd piled up rocks and branches, creating a crude barrier. When they came upon it, they hesitated. The scruffy man picked up a stick, gripping it like a weapon, but I knew he wouldn't use it. They turned, retracing their steps, and I followed. The second one was easier. The man with the glasses tripped on a root and twisted his ankle. He tried to keep up, but his limp slowed them down. Eventually, the others left him propped against a tree with a bottle of water and promises to return. He sat there for hours, his head jerking up at every sound. I let him sit, let the fear seep into his bones. When I finally moved towards him, he didn't even run. He just stared, his eyes wide and wet as I stepped out from the shadows. By the time the other two came back for him, he was gone. I watched them from a distance, saw the scruffy man's face twist with rage and the woman crumble into sobs. They stayed put that night, too afraid to move any further. I let them have their fire. I wanted them to feel safe, if only for a little while. They didn't get far the next day. The woman's plaited hair had come loose and she kept stopping to fix it, her hands trembling too much to tie it back properly. The scruffy man snapped at her, his patience frayed. It didn't matter. They weren't going to make it. When I finally stepped out onto the trail ahead of them, they froze. The man raised his stick again, his hands shaking so badly I thought he might drop it. The woman clung to his arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They didn't run. I liked it when they didn't run. I stood there, letting them see me properly for the first time. I wasn't in a hurry. I had all the time in the world. The house was small but cozy, tucked away on the edge of a quiet, almost forgotten village. I liked it immediately. It had a low picket fence, a sagging roof, and a faint smell of damp that I convinced myself added to the charm. I needed a fresh start, somewhere far from the prying eyes and stifling chatter of the city. When I met Mr. Turner, the landlord, he seemed harmless enough. He was polite, soft-spoken, and slightly awkward, in a way that mirrored my own discomfort with strangers. The basement door was the only thing that felt out of place. It sat in the corner of the kitchen, heavily padlocked, with scratches around the edges as though something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. I tried not to think too much about it. Everyone has their quirks, I told myself. Maybe he used it for storage or kept tools down there. I settled into a quiet routine over the first few days. The village was sleepy, its streets empty by dusk, the air heavy with silence. Every so often I'd hear Mr. Turner's car pull up in the evening. He'd let himself into the house next door, the one he lived in, and the sound of his footsteps would fade into nothing. It was comforting in a way, knowing someone was nearby. Then I started hearing the noises. At first I thought it was the pipes, a faint, rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. But as the nights wore on, the sounds became harder to ignore. Scraping, tapping, and once a muffled sound that sent a cold rush of adrenaline through my veins. It almost sounded like crying. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Old houses creak and groan, it's just the wood settling, I thought. But the unease clung to me, turning every shadow into something darker, every creak into something alive. I started sleeping with the light on. One morning, when Mr. Turner came by to collect the rent, I found myself staring at his hands. They were rough and calloused, speckled with small scars. He smiled faintly when he handed me the receipt, and for a moment I almost blurted out a question about the noises, but I didn't. Something in his gaze made the words stick in my throat. I began paying closer attention to him after that. His movements, the times he came and went, the way his curtains were always drawn tight, no matter the hour. A few days later, I found myself standing by the basement door, the padlock staring back at me. My heart pounded as I crouched down to inspect the scratches. They weren't random, as I'd first thought. They formed thin parallel grooves as though made by fingernails. The smell started a week later. It was faint at first, just a whiff of something sour that drifted up from the basement door. I tried to ignore it, lighting candles and opening windows, but it grew stronger. It wasn't the smell of rot. Not quite. It was something worse, something alive and sickly. By then I was too afraid to confront Mr. Turner. I stopped looking out the window when his car pulled up. I started keeping my phone by my side at all times, though I didn't know who I'd call or what I'd say. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a torch and the excuse that I was looking for a leak, I knocked on his door. He answered almost immediately, his face calm, but his eyes too alert. He said he hadn't heard anything, but the way he lingered in the doorway, blocking my view of his hallway, made my stomach churn. Later that night, I heard the noises again, louder this time. Something dragged, something thudding, and then the crying, clear, desperate sobs that cut through the stillness like a blade. I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the basement door. The smell had grown unbearable. I knew I had to do something, but as I stared at the phone in my hand, I couldn't bring myself to dial. What if I was wrong? What if this was nothing? What if it was something? The next morning, Mr. Turner's car was gone. The village was as silent as ever. I stood by the basement door, the padlock cold under my fingers. I didn't open it. Instead, I packed my things and left. Weeks later, I saw his name in the papers. They'd found something in his house, a body, they said, or what was left of one. There was no mention of the basement or what might have been inside, but I still hear the crying in my dreams. It's always the same. A faint, desperate sound that grows louder until I wake up, my heart pounding, the phantom smell of damp and decay clinging to my nostrils. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive back from the company retreat, nothing dramatic, just a few hours on the road, dropping off everyone in turn before heading home. I was driving as usual, everyone else was crammed into the car, dozing or scrolling on their phone. It had been a long day, and the countryside rolling past the windows felt endless. The first sign of trouble came when the car started to stutter. At first I thought it was just the uneven road, an old single-track lane winding through fields and woods. But when the engine coughed and the dashboard lights flickered, I knew something was wrong. I pulled over as the car spluttered one last time and died. It was pitch black outside. No streetlights, no passing cars, just the faint hum of insects in the fields and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I tried the ignition again. Nothing, no one had signal, not a single bar on anyone's phone. We were stranded. We debated what to do next, but in the end it wasn't like we had much of a choice. We'd passed a farmhouse about a mile back, its lights faint through the trees. It wasn't ideal knocking on a stranger's door in the middle of nowhere, but it beat sitting in the dark all night. So we set off, walking back along the lane, the torch on my phone, barely enough to light the way. The farmhouse looked different up close. It was bigger than I'd thought, a hulking shape against the night sky. The front porch light was on, casting a yellow glow over the steps, and I could see movement inside through the curtains. It was reassuring, at least for a moment. The door opened almost as soon as we knocked. A man stood there, middle-aged, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. He smiled, wide and friendly, and invited us in. His wife appeared behind him, her hands dusted with flour like she'd been baking. They seemed normal enough, kind, helpful even. They didn't seem surprised to see us, though, and something about that niggled at the back of my mind. They insisted we come inside while the man checked the car. The house smelled of bread and wood smoke, warm and cozy, but the silence hung too heavy, like the place was waiting for something to happen. The furniture was old-fashioned, mismatched, and the wallpaper was faded and curling at the edges. There were photos on the walls, black and white pictures of stern-faced people, none of whom looked anything like the couple. The man left to fetch his tools, but when I glanced out of the window, I couldn't see him heading towards the lane. Instead, he disappeared around the side of the house, out of sight. I waited for a while, pacing the small sitting room, but when he didn't return, I started to feel uneasy. The wife brought us tea, but something about the way she watched us, standing just a little too still in the doorway, made my skin crawl. I noticed how she never seemed to blink, her eyes darting to each of us as if she were trying to memorize us. None of us touched the tea. I decided to go and check on the man, make sure he was actually looking at the car. I made an excuse and slipped outside, but as soon as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized something was off. The lane was quiet, the car still sitting dark and lifeless where we'd left it. There was no sign of him, not even a torch beam in the distance. That's when I noticed it, the barn. It was set back behind the house, half hidden by trees, its doors slightly ajar. Light flickered from inside, faint but unmistakable. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept towards it, careful to stay out of view of the farmhouse windows. The smell hit me first, a sickly, sweet stench that made my stomach churn. I pushed the barn door open just enough to peer inside, and what I saw stopped me cold. There were hooks hanging from the rafters, tools laid out neatly on a table, and tarps spread across the floor. The tools weren't for fixing cars, they were stained, rusted, and wrong. In the corner of the barn was a pile. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but as I moved closer, the shapes resolved into something unmistakable. Clothes, shoes, bags. Too many to belong to one person, or even a family. I heard a noise behind me, a soft scuff of boots on dirt, and I turned to see the man standing in the doorway, his wide smile now twisted into something colder, sharper. He didn't say a word, just stood there, blocking the exit. I bolted past him, shoving him hard enough to knock him off balance, and ran back towards the house. I shouted for the others, my voice cracking, but as I reached the porch, the door slammed shut in my face. I pounded on it, hearing movement inside, but no one answered. The lights inside the house flicked off one by one, and then the porch light went dark too. I was left standing there in the blackness, my breath loud in my ears. I could hear footsteps now, not just one pair, but several, coming from all directions. I didn't wait to find out who or what was out there. I turned and ran, the lane stretching out endlessly in front of me. I didn't look back, not even when I thought I heard my name being called, faint and distorted from the trees. We'd been at sea for nearly a week when things started to go wrong. It was just another trip, nothing out of the ordinary. A few of us out on the trawler trying to make a decent haul. The waters were calm, the sky was clear, and the days were long. Out there, surrounded by nothing but open water, it felt like the world had stopped. There were 5 of us on board, the skipper, me, and 3 other lads who'd been doing this for years. We all knew each other well enough, and the work was routine. You wake up, haul in the nets, gut the fish, then do it all over again. It's tiring, sure, but you get used to it. It was on the 5th morning that we realized something wasn't right. One of the lads, Danny, didn't come out of his cabin. He was usually the first up, so when we didn't see him, the skipper sent me to check on him. I banged on his door, but there was no answer. When I opened it, the room was empty. His bunk was unmade and his gear was still there, but he was gone. We searched the whole boat, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. It didn't make sense. The sea had been calm all night and no one had heard anything. The skipper reckoned he must have gone overboard, maybe slipped or something, but none of us could believe it. Danny wasn't careless, and he knew the risks better than anyone. The mood changed after that. The usual banter was gone, replaced by silence and glances over shoulders. It felt like the boat had gotten smaller, the walls closing in, the ocean around us stretching out forever. We still had work to do, though, so we kept at it, hauling in the nets and going through the motions. By nightfall, the unease had settled in properly. None of us wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Someone had to have seen or heard something. People don't just disappear, not like that. I stayed up later than usual, sitting on deck and watching the water, half expecting to see something surface, a body maybe, or some kind of clue. But there was nothing, just the endless black of the sea. The second night, it happened again. This time it was Sam. He'd been up top with the skipper, working the winch, and then he was gone. The rest of us didn't even realize until we found the winch spinning freely, the nets dragging in the water. We searched the boat again, frantic this time, shouting his name until our voices gave out. But just like Danny, there was no sign of him. I could feel the fear in the air now, thick and heavy. We all knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. The skipper locked up the cabin doors that night, and we took turns keeping watch, but none of us got much sleep. Every noise, every creak of the boat made my heart pound. By the next day, the tension was unbearable. None of us spoke much, and the work became slow, almost mechanical. I caught the skipper watching me a few times. His eyes narrowed like he was trying to figure something out. I started watching him too. It was hard not to. When people start disappearing, you can't help but wonder. That night I heard a noise outside my cabin. It was faint, just a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged along the deck. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The door to my cabin was locked, but I could hear it, someone moving, slow. I wanted to call out, but the words caught in my throat. My hand hovered over the lock, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. Instead, I sat there, gripping the edge of the bunk, waiting for the noise to stop. It felt like hours before it finally faded away. When I came out the next morning, the skipper was gone. No one said it, but I knew the other two were thinking what I was thinking. One of us had to be next. Didn't talk, didn't even look at each other. We just worked in silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. That afternoon, while I was on deck, I saw something in the water. A shape, dark and indistinct, just beneath the surface. It moved slowly, circling the boat like a shadow. I called out to the others, but by the time they came, it was gone. They looked at me like I was losing it. But I know what I saw. By nightfall, I was the only one left. I don't know how it happened. I woke up to the sound of a struggle, metal clanging against metal. And when I got out there, the deck was empty. Just me, the waves, and the silence. The others were gone, their cabins empty, the doors swinging open in the wind. Now it's just me. The boat feels like a coffin drifting on an endless sea. I don't know who or what did this. I don't know if I'll make it back to shore, but I can feel it, whatever it is. It's still out there, watching, waiting. I'd had a long day. I'd been on the road since early morning, and it was already well past midnight when the delivery request came through. The address was out in the middle of nowhere, but I figured I could handle one more. It was just a pizza, after all. The GPS led me down narrow, winding roads until I found myself at the base of a long driveway leading to a house that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was chipped and the windows were covered in grime. It felt like the kind of place you'd see in a horror film, but I shook off the thought. People lived in all sorts of places, right? I parked up by the front door, glancing at the house one last time. There were no lights on inside, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. It didn't feel right, but it was late and I was tired. I grabbed the pizza and knocked on the door. It took a while for someone to answer. When they did, it was a man, middle-aged, thin, with pale skin and a look in his eyes that was hard to place. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me for a long moment. Finally, he stepped aside to let me in, taking the pizza from my hands without a word. I didn't know what to make of it, but I followed him inside. It was dark, colder than I expected, with only a few lights flickering dimly. The man didn't speak, didn't offer anything in the way of a tip or even an acknowledgement. I stood there awkwardly for a moment, waiting for him to say something, but he just kept walking into the house without looking back. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me before I could even reach for the handle. I jumped, startled, and spun around to see the man standing at the door, watching me. He didn't move. "Excuse me?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to get going." He didn't answer. The silence in the room thickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I reached for the handle again, but this time it wouldn't budge. I tried harder, but it was like the door was stuck, jammed shut from the inside. That's when I realized there was no way out. I turned to face the man, my heart pounding. He hadn't moved, still just standing there, staring. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Maybe this was some sort of prank, but it didn't feel like one. I stepped back slowly, my eyes never leaving him. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The man's eyes didn't shift and his breathing was shallow, slow. It was like he was waiting for something, like he knew exactly what was about to happen. I tried the door one last time, pushing with all my strength, but it wouldn't move. My panic began to rise. I backed away from it, and the man still stood there, unmoving. Then I heard something, a faint scraping sound from somewhere behind me. It was soft at first, barely audible over the thudding of my heart. But it grew louder, and then I noticed the shadows at the edges of the room, the way they seemed to shift just a little more than they should have. I spun around again, my breath coming in short gasps. The walls felt like they were closing in, the space around me narrowing. I could hear the sound now, clearer, like something or someone was moving through the dark, just out of sight. I felt the coldness settle deeper in the room, a chill that didn't belong to the air. I turned back to the man, my voice shaking. "Let me out." He didn't respond, just kept standing there, staring at me. I looked at the door again, desperately pushing against it, but nothing happened. I could feel the panic rising, the air in the room growing thicker, heavier. It felt like I was suffocating. I wasn't alone. I knew it now. There was something else in the house with me. The scraping sound was louder now, closer. I could hear it moving toward me, slow. And then, through the dark, I saw it. A shape in the corner of the room, shifting like a shadow, growing taller, more defined. My stomach turned as it moved toward me, the scraping sound now unmistakable, like claws dragging along the floor. I backed away from it, my mind racing for any escape, but there was nowhere to go. The house felt like it was shrinking, trapping me inside. The man didn't move. He didn't even seem to notice the thing in the corner. He just kept standing there, his eyes fixed on me, almost like he was waiting for something. The thing was closer now, its shape taking form, a dark silhouette against the dim light. I could see it clearly. A twisted, monstrous figure, its body contorted in ways it shouldn't have been. I could feel my legs give way beneath me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The thing reached for me, its long claws glinting in the dim light, and I knew I was never going to leave this house. Then, just as it reached out to grab me, the door behind me slammed open with a force that knocked me to the floor. But when I looked back, the door was wide open, and I could see the outside, the dark, snowy night. The figure was gone, and the man was nowhere to be seen. I didn't think, I just ran out the door, down the steps, and into the snow. The cold bit at my skin, but it didn't matter. I ran without looking back until I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breath. When I made it back to my car, I drove off as fast as I could, not caring where I went, just away from that house. The road felt endless, like I was running from something that was always just behind me.